Mr. Masood, welcome to Morocco, your country. You are currently the president of the Center for Global Development in Washington. What exactly does that mean?
Center for Global Development is a think tank that's based in Washington and in London, and we focus on how to make the international development system work more effectively. So many people give advice to developing countries on what Kenya should do with its education system or what Morocco might do with public enterprises. We focus on how do the rich countries of the world and the big international institutions support countries like Kenya or Morocco or other parts of the world in achieving their full potential.
So we are really, and you really will have a lot of work these days. If we talk about globalization, is that still à la mode, or do we see a rupture of supply lines? Do we see estrangement from globalization, or the idea that the global world will be better economics and will help each nation? With the virus, we realized that we were fragile because the supplies didn't come.
Certainly, if you look at the experience of the last 20 years, the process of linking countries together through trade, through financial flows, has resulted in an improvement in living standards around the world. Many countries in Asia, many countries in Latin America have profited from that. Many countries in Africa have profited from being part of a global economy. But it has also brought with it certain vulnerabilities. And the last 3 years have made us much more conscious of those vulnerabilities. I would say there are 3 kinds of vulnerabilities that exist today and we will have to address as we think about what is the nature of globalization going forward. So I prefer to think of it more as a mutation of how we think about globalization rather than more or less globalization. So the first vulnerability we discovered is that our supply chains had become too concentrated, too dependent on certain countries, notably China for manufacturing, and we found that maybe it's more useful to diversify these supply chains so that we don't depend only on 1 or 2 supply routes as we had become in the past. Now, I should say diversify is not the same as what people like to call onshoring, which is, oh, we need to bring everything back to our own countries.
Doing our pharmaceutical...
If we do everything in every country, that's going to lead to a lot of inefficiencies. Inefficiency is another way of saying people become poorer in the sense that they won't be able to buy as many goods at the prices that they can afford. So that's one nature, is to go from concentrated supply chain and supply lines to more diversified ones. The second thing that happened over the course of the last 20 years is that we did not take enough care about the people who were losing out from the changes in our own economy that were coming from trading more with the rest of the world. So our society might have been richer off, we might have been able to buy cheaper television sets or appliances or clothes, but the people who were previously working in certain industries lost their job. And I think, to be fair, we did not, when I say we, the countries, the rich countries of the world particularly, did not do enough to ensure that these people who were losing their jobs, and also in a sense not just their job, but their sense of dignity, their sense of what it was that they were contributing to society, that we did enough to support them and to support their transition. You cannot go from being a productive worker in a steel mill to being a media influencer. And I think we were just unrealistic sometimes in doing
Idealizing.
that. We talked about only in big numbers, and human lives that were behind those big numbers sometimes didn't get the attention. So that resulted in a disillusionment with globalization. At the same time, technology came in. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, globalization accounts for a small part of the transition in jobs and the nature of work. Technology is very important as well. The changing requirements for education are very important. But it was easy to pick on globalization and say, this is the problem. People became disillusioned with it.
Yeah, but the virus, COVID, suddenly confronted us, as you mentioned, with the stop or slowing down of supply lines. The Germans suddenly didn't get pharmaceutical material because the Chinese said we need it first. And Morocco got some of the protective gear from China, but very often they were not in time because they were thinking about their own country. So isn't there a disillusionment?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the disillusionment, as I say, comes partly from this supply chain lines being very concentrated, breaking down, partly from the inequality and sense of being left behind in the otherwise you see prosperity, but in a way, if you're seeing this bypass, you see prosperity go around you, but your little town, where there used to be a steel mill, that steel mill was providing employment for you. Suddenly that steel mill is gone. What good is that prosperity for you? It's rubbing it in your face, and telling you, look, you're not part of it. But I do think that there's the one other thing that has happened that you just pointed out, very important, which is that over the course of the last few years, there has also been a weakening of the international cooperation and the governance of issues. So our problems are becoming more and more global. Climate change, the pandemic. You can't solve the pandemic in one country until everybody in the world is protected. You are going to be vulnerable to the next variant of the same virus or to the next virus that will come along. But our ability and willingness to cooperate internationally, to find common ground, has become weaker. And in particular, this is linked also to the growing tensions between the big superpowers, between the United States and China, for example. That makes it harder to find common solutions to problems like the pandemic, like climate change, like how do you deal with the excessive debt in so many low-income countries that is making it hard for them to invest in education, to invest in health, because all of these things require people to come around the table, sit together, and today it's a little bit harder.
How do you get that? How do you get Mr. Putin together with Mr. Biden?
And I would say, well, certainly the war on Ukraine, Russia's war on Ukraine, has had a further accentuation of the breakdown
of the supply lines.
Well, supply lines, most notably in energy, obviously, but in some ways that is something that the Europeans want to have, is no longer want to depend on Russia for energy in the same way, but also in terms of the ability to just come around the table and cooperate. And I found it interesting that the G20 group, which is the group of the 20 largest economies, 80% of the world's GDP, that for the last year, the discussion is not what will they achieve, but will they even be able to meet together, sit in a room, and issue a communique?
Which they did.
Well, in the end, they kind of did. I think Indonesia did a fantastic job in actually being able to bring people together without people walking out of the room, but that was the achievement. And in terms of the difficult decisions that have to be made today, whether it's on how we're going to deal with climate change, how we're going to deal with remaining issues of poverty, how we're going to deal with the next pandemic, hard to make progress on them if you don't have that cooperative spirit. And I think that says a lot also for the role that middle powers like Morocco will play going forward.
But is there an option of non-aligned nations coming together and just ignoring for a moment the big powers and say we have solutions? Or is that big power?
I think that's the big question a lot of people are debating, and I think it varies a lot by the topic that you're talking about. I don't think there's a single answer, but I do feel that it is the middle powers that I call them, I'm not talking about China or the US, but if you think about the middle powers, Morocco, but also some of the richer countries that are middle powers, it is in their interest to work within a rules-based system. Because the big guys will always find ways to get what they want or not what they want. It's the middle powers that need a rules-based system. And I think the solutions, the innovations, are also going to come a lot from the middle powers. So the kind of conference we're at today, here, the Atlantic Dialogues, is an excellent example of bringing together the South Atlantic on both sides, Africa, Latin America, but also bringing in European countries and the US to try and see if we can find those opportunities for cooperation. Because the flip side of every challenge is, I'm a firm believer in it, is that you do see the opportunities for the next 20 years. I have no doubt that 20 years from now, when we're having this conversation again, we will be living in a world that is a better, and people will be doing better. The path there is going to be a little bit tricky for the next few years.
But you mentioned rule-based societies. As we see with Russia's behavior, without going into the debate who is guilty and not guilty.
Oh, I think it's pretty clear who's guilty.
Okay, yes, but so the rule-based societies have been interrupted. The Russians don't take international treaties, international laws, international whatever. They just disregard and threw it in the wastebasket. So how do you go back to the trust of global powers to find solutions together? How do you get the Russians together with the Americans?
Yeah, look, I think Russia clearly stepped outside the rules-based framework, committed an act of aggression against its neighbor, and in many ways is paying the price for it. I mean, in some ways, people in Russia are suffering also as a result of this.
We all pay the price for it.
Yeah, and well, of course we are. And the question is that the Russian government is going to find itself, I suspect, living under a regime of sanctions and constraints for many years to come, and it'll be a difficult process bringing Russia back into a fold of nations, and when that happens, how that happens, is a lot of people are thinking about. But I would say what this does mean is that for the rest of the world, it's even more important to keep demonstrating that this is not a reason for any of us to step out of those rules, because that is a fraying of the system that would result. I think we need to consolidate and make that system work, because I don't see for us, for countries like those that like Morocco, where we're in today, but many others like it, a future that would be manageable without a set of rules and norms within which we navigate our relationships with the rest of the world.
If we see what is happening in Russia, sanctions, as you mentioned, it makes me hopeful that the Chinese will not move into Taiwan, because they know the consequences for world trade and world economic development, because they rely on selling lots of things to the Europeans and to the Africans and so on. Are the Chinese-based, rule-based societies?
China has been one of the greatest beneficiaries of becoming part of a rules-based international system for the last 20 years. China has become a member of the World Trade Organization. China is a big player in the multilateral organizations like the World Bank, like the IMF. I think China's whole trading relationship with the rest of the world relies on there being a set of rules. Clearly, there are great advantages, not just for China, but for the rest of the world, for us to continue to have a relationship between this big and large, important global country, second biggest power in the world today, to be a productive and constructive relationship that would then enable all sides to grow from it. Now, there are obviously political tensions. There's tensions around Taiwan, there's tensions around South China Seas, and those have to be managed. But I mean, my hope, and I think the hope of many people, is that we can manage these things without having to do so in a way that exacerbates the fraying of the rules-based system.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for giving me this chance.